Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today's guest is Dr. Serena Roney-Dougal. Serena is one of the few people in Britain to have obtained a PhD for parapsychology, exploring the relationship between subliminal perception and psychic awareness. She has had over 40 years of study and experience in scientific, magical and spiritual explorations of the psyche, has lectured and taught courses, seminars and workshops in America, Britain, Europe, Japan and India, has written numerous articles, both technical and popular, and 2 books, Where Science and Magic Meet and The Fairy Faith. She is currently a Green Councillor in Glastonbury, England. In today's conversation, we discussed Serena's early work comparing psi to subliminal perception, and also her work linking the pineal gland in the brain to psychic experience. We spoke about her experiments with meditation and psi, which were conducted in India and included a life-changing visit to Ladakh, or Little Tibet. We discussed the Tibetan view of consciousness and rebirth, and the experiences of some of the Tibetans with whom she worked. We also briefly spoke about an experiment at Sami Ling Monastery in Scotland, linking psi performance with geomagnetic cycles. We finished off with some discussion of the links between environmental awareness and consciousness. How did you become interested in parapsychology? What was the sort of trigger for that?
Well, I grew up with it as a child because in Scotland it was quite normal. My mother talked about seeing a ghost when she was a child in Wales. My dad, if I remember, my aunt had some blocked field drains that were causing the cellar to flood, and he got out some coat hangers and twisted them and doused for where the blockage was. And when we lived out at Gifford, the big house, Yesterhoose, had a grey lady ghost, and it also had a goblin hall. And it was just stories of families with witches' curses on them, or people with second sight families. And it was definitely in our family. My mother used to talk about her great aunt who could read the cards and so on. So we considered it absolutely normal. And then when I moved to do psychology at UCL, I was quite shocked to discover there were people who didn't believe in it. Not for me, it wasn't a matter of belief. It was a matter of experience, knowledge. There was nothing to do with belief. But fortunately, there was a postgraduate who was working under one of the top people in subliminal perception at the time. And he got permission to do 2 lab classes on parapsychology when I was in my second year. And that was it. I mean, it was far better than running rats in cages. And I got permission to do my final year undergrad study on comparing subliminal perception with telepathy or clairvoyance, although I did telepathy at the time. So as an undergrad, I fixed up a tiny little study and did that. And then when I came back to wanting to do a PhD, the same professor agreed to support me. I couldn't actually do it at UCL because they couldn't have parapsychology happening as a PhD in UCL. But one of his students worked at City University in London, and he agreed to take me on. And because he agreed to take me on, and because there was one of the big people in the Society for Psychic Research, who was head of the engineering department at City University, the university agreed to take me on. So the head of the psychology department basically had to bow under pressure. And so I started my PhD there, and that was where we essentially devised the sort of research that I would be doing and did most of the experimentation there.
Tell me a little bit more about subliminal perception and how that seems to be not unlike sort of psi perception.
Okay, yes. So because Professor Norman Dixon was one of the key people, obviously I was helped to discover everything that was known at that time. So we're now talking the late 70s, everything that was known in the late 70s. And so he helped me not only work out how to compare the two, but also all the different questionnaires and so on, so that we could go into the psychology of the participants who were taking part. And what we did was I managed to get the use of a Faraday chamber in the City University optics department, which meant that everybody was shielded from all the electromagnetic radiation that London, of course, is swamped by. And we used a tape recorder we didn't use white noise. What I did was I recorded a waterfall, which is a more pleasant noise than pure artificial white noise. And so we created what is called the Ganzfeld, where you have white noise in the ears and you have half ping pong balls on your eyes with a red light. So you just have a red glow that you're looking at and the white noise that you're listening to sitting in the Faraday chamber. And in that chamber, people were just asked to free associate to whatever came into their minds. And so for half an hour, they just talked about everything. Meanwhile, in another room, separated by 2 rooms from the Faraday chamber, there was a sender who was given a computer program that basically, semi-random, told them whether it would be a subliminal session or a telepathy session. A subliminal session meant that words, we used words that were recorded around a theme. The words would go through to the person in the Ganzfeld at a level that they would not know they were hearing them. So prior to the session, we did a hearing test to discover at what point they could actually hear the word, and it was set at below that level. In a telepathy test, they switched off from the sender. The sender switched off from the receiver, and they heard the words themselves and tried to send through to the receiver. Meanwhile, I was recording everything that the receiver was hearing, and at the end of the session, I would go into them and we would talk through what they had experienced. So they would describe to me their experiences, and because I'd heard it all, I was able to remind them of stuff they might have forgotten. Then they looked at a sheet of paper that did we use 4 or 5? Probably 4. 4 different sets of words. One set of which would have been the one chosen semi-random by the sender. And I, of course, knew nothing. I didn't know which set had been chosen. And I then left the person to rank and rate the different sets. And when they'd done so, they came out of the chamber, and we called the sender in, and the sender then revealed which set they'd had. So basic Ganzfeld design, but with a choice of it being either telepathy or subliminal. And what we found was that there were some people who were very perceptive, and they tended to choose the targets correctly. Up to 80% of the time, I had 2 people who got 80% correct, which is quite phenomenal.
Wow.
And then there were other people who were significantly below. And so to a significant level, one person was like 30% choice and 50% is average. No, 20, well, whatever it was. I can't remember the percentages. It's too long ago. This is back in the 70s, remember? But what we discovered was that those people who were correct on the subliminal sessions were the people who were correct on the telepathy sessions. And those people who were missing on the subliminal also missed on the telepathy. So in other words, we were looking at personality types. You were either sensitive and open to stuff that was coming in at a subliminal level, whether psychic or physical, or you were closed to it. You were either an open person or a closed person. And one of the psychological tests we did was a questionnaire called Openness to Experience, which you probably come across because it's used quite widely. And basically people who are open to experience are those people who are open to both psychic and subliminal. And the subliminal material tends to come through to consciousness in a similar way to the psychic material. In other words, it's coming through an imagery, it's coming through in dreams, all of those different ways that the subliminal comes through is the same way that the psychic comes through.
So subliminal perception is essentially when you perceive something that you perceive at some level, but it doesn't affect you consciously, but unconsciously it presents itself in biases. That's and what you seem to be saying is that with psi material, where there's no presentation of any sort of perceptual stimulus, a very similar process seems to happen.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
So you were doing some quite pioneering work, because in the decades afterwards, this psychologist Jim Carpenter came up with what he called first sight theory, which was essentially a theory that psi operates like subliminal perception. And I remember reading his book and thinking, this is very similar to what you've been saying for several decades. So does that feel like a vindication?
I wasn't the only one. At the time that I was doing it, there were quite a few parapsychologists who were working in this area. There was quite a lot of research going on at the time, which is why I got the permission and why Professor Norman Dixon was really interested in me doing it. And in fact, at a PA conference in Edinburgh, he was the invited speaker. So this would have been the very late 70s, early 80s. When they had the conference in Edinburgh, because so many of the parapsychologists were so aware of this similarity between subliminal perception and psi, and because so much research had already taken part, which I was building on. So I wasn't coming out of the blue with it. I was building on other work. So there was a Dutch parapsychologist, Johnson, Professor Johnson. So he'd done lots of work on subliminal perception and psi.
I mean, I think that's often true, though, isn't it? You're always working in a team, even if you're not in immediate contact with the team, and it's all about sort of incrementally building up that evidence base. So,
and it's standing on the shoulders of giants is what it's called.
Yes, very much, very much. But it's quite interesting too, because you talked about the Ganzfeld conditions, and the Ganzfeld is a major sort of experimental paradigm in parapsychology, but mostly it's done with sort of visual images or videos. Yeah. And it's interesting that this is a variation of that.
Yeah, I might have been the only person who used the auditory, but the auditory, because you've got the white noise, the auditory actually does work very well, because it enables a comparison between subliminal and psi, whereas visual would be very difficult because you've got the ping pong balls and the red light, and it'd be very difficult to present something visually that was subliminal. So using the white noise mask made the comparison a very simple experimental technique.
Yes, and the key here seems to be what's termed the subliminal mind, which you discuss in your book. So could you say a little bit about what the subliminal mind is?
So hypnagogia. There's a book called Hypnagogia, and the Ganzfeld is key on creating the hypnagogic state in which we are. So if you think about when you're falling asleep, and let's say a phone rings or something and you get woken up, and this is before you've actually fallen asleep, you will find that your mind is full of very strong imagery. It's a bit like dreaming, but you're not dreaming.
Yes.
And so it's this half-awake state that is where information that's come in through the day that at a subliminal level that you haven't been aware of can actually come through into consciousness. This is a state of mind. And the dream state of mind as well is a state of mind in which subliminal material can come into consciousness. So let's talk about what subliminal material is. And it's probably easiest thinking of it in terms of hearing, is that if you're in a crowded room or on the tube or something and there's lots of people talking, and all of a sudden you notice way at the far end of the carriage that there's somebody who you think you might have met, and what you discover is that they actually said your name at that point. Now, there was no way you could consciously hear it, but it alerted you. And so this is understood as subliminal perception, and it translates into personality stuff. So there are some people who always manage to walk under the ladder when the pot of paint is about to fall. And there are other people who never do. So there are lucky people and unlucky people. And a lot of this luck is actually because one is sensitive to subliminal impressions. In other words, the person who is sensitive will have noticed subliminally that the paint pot was not securely tied, whereas the person who is close to the subliminal stuff will have ignored that perception that the paint pot wasn't properly secured. So it's a question of being very open to what one might call the inner voice, the still small voice, and responding to it rather than going afterwards, oh yes, I knew I shouldn't have done that.
Yes.
And that we all know that one. Oh, God, I knew I shouldn't have done that. It's a common thing. And so with training, and training does help, and one of the good training techniques is meditation, is you can actually learn to become more sensitive and open to that still small voice.
So that leads us on to your work with meditators. You started working with meditators to look at things like side performance in India. Is that correct?
Yes. So it came out of a whole load of other work. But basically, well, it came out of the work with my pineal gland, really, in that at the same time as I was doing the PhD, I was practicing, I was being taught yoga at the Satyananda Yoga School in London. And the head of that school was Swami Satyananda Saraswati, and he had written a book because he was interested in linking science with yogic teachings. And his book was called Agya Chakra, the Third Eye, the Pineal Gland. And he located what the yogis call the psychic center, the third eye, in the pineal gland in the center of the brain. And he suggested that maybe the pineal gland was doing something, creating chemicals or something that was actually going to facilitate one to become aware at the psychic level. At the same time, I got invited to present this was my PhD work only when it was at the first year, when I was doing the literature research and putting together the ideas. And there was somebody called McDonnell Douglas who was of DC-10 aeroplane fame.
Oh, yes.
At the time, he was funding research in parapsychology. And one of the things he did was give money for students to be able to attend conferences. And so my ideas got accepted at the PA convention for a 10-minute presentation, and I got paid from the McDonnell Douglas Fund to fly over from Britain to America to do the presentation. And I obviously I was quite young at the time, and I was very keen, and I got on the plane and I arrived in Chicago and got on the Greyhound bus and arrived in St. Louis, Missouri, where the conference was to be held. But I arrived 24 hours early, just because I was keen. And of course, I didn't have money for a hotel. And I found the campus where the conference was going to happen, and I walked around, and I discovered that in America, campuses close in the summer because all the students are off earning money. But finally, I found an open door that was behind some bushes and down some steps. And in there was a cafe with half a dozen students. So I got myself a coffee and sidled up to the students and said, "Excuse me, could anyone give me a bed for the night?" And this lovely young man who had hair down to his waist, remember we're talking the 70s, said, "Sure, you can come and stay with me." And went and stayed with him, and he had a lovely girlfriend who was a potter. And he was doing postgraduate research into psychotropic plants. And he had just come back from living in the Amazon with the Shuar people. This is way before it became tourist stuff, way before. We're talking 70s. Doing research into ayahuasca. And he was really interested because the shamanic people considered that ayahuasca was the opening for the psychic experience. And there was a Chilean psychotherapist, Claudio Naranjo, who considered that it worked because it was mimicking chemicals in the pineal gland. So this is all speculation at the time. But he gave me all the papers and Claudio Naranjo's book, and from then on fed me research material because, of course, here was the pineal gland being suggested by Claudio Naranjo and the shamanic work, which was suggesting that ayahuasca really did make one psychic or enable the psychic experience to become conscious. And then I had a friend who was working in London in a hospital doing neurochemistry. And every time he came across pineal gland research, he would feed me that material. And so by 1981, so 3 years later, we actually had the neurochemical experimentation showing that the pineal gland was producing similar chemicals to ayahuasca. And so I tied all the pieces together, the yogic information, the shamanic information, and the neurochemical information to suggest that the pineal gland was facilitating a state of consciousness in which we could become aware. And one neurochemist doing work in this area suggested that what the pineal gland was doing was creating chemicals that stimulated the dreaming experience. And so that took back to the dream mind and subliminal perception, and the dream mind being a key state of consciousness for psychic experiences, which had also been found in parapsychology, well, actually in psychic research, from spontaneous reports. So people who write in with spontaneous reports, the majority of precognitive experiences happen when you are dreaming. I think it's 60% occur whilst you're in the dream mind. So everything linked together to say that the pineal gland was key in enabling the state of consciousness for psychic experience. And so rather than I tried initially to do research with ayahuasca, but I couldn't get the SBR to fund it because, of course, I'd be working with Class A drugs. And although the Home Office had said yes and the local doctor was willing to supervise, I couldn't get the money to do it. So then when I got invited to go and work at the ashram in India, one of the things that was interesting me was, of course, that meditation was key to opening up the third eye. that Swami Satyananda, who headed this ashram, had said, meditations for the third eye can help one to become aware of psychic experiences. So as I was working with postgraduate students at the ashram, and they obviously needed practical work as well as the theoretical work, I suggested experimentation to them, one of which was to record dreams and see if that was working in terms of psychic awareness. And the other was for meditation experience. So some people were beginners and other people had lots of meditation experience. And there was another member of the SBR who did a computer program for me. Over the 3 years in the ashram, we refined this computer program. He called it Pregog, so that we would basically have a free response design, a bit like the Ganzfeld, but working with meditation instead. And now we were using videos. We were using the picture level of stuff that was normal in Ganzfeld and free response work at the time. And after the first year working with the students, I asked the guru if I could actually work with the swamis as well, because of course the students only had a few years of experience, whereas the swamis had up to 30, 35 years. And so I then took the students' research and turned it into my own research, working with the swamis as well. So I moved it on from being a 1-year student study to being a 3-year my research study. And I got a statistician from America, Jerry Solfin, to do the design and the stats with me. So I had somebody who did the computer program, somebody who did the design and stats, and we built it up to a proper double, triple blind research program with me working with both students and swamis. And the results from that suggested that over the years of practice, yes, one did become more aware at the psychic level. And in my third year working at the ashram, for various reasons, they're long stories, great stories, but I'll leave you the great stories for the moment and focus on what I'm the main meat of it. I had connected with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans, and the Dalai Lama had said he'd be interested in, or rather the secretary had written me a letter saying that they were interested in this sort of research. And at the same time, the ashram had to stop its postgraduate program of students. Now, me and the statistician, Jerry Solfin, had put into Bial, who is a Portuguese foundation that gives money for parapsychology, to fund this research with the yogis. But I could no longer work with the yogis, but I had the letter from the Dalai Lama secretary suggesting that they would be interested in this. So we changed our application from yogic monks and nuns to Buddhist monks and nuns and sent it into Bial, and they funded me for 3 years more research. So now I was working with the Tibetans, and this was a whole different ballgame. I mean, we had the program up and running. It was in its final form. We changed the images to ones that Tibetans could recognize, and they were photos from Tibet, from a friend of mine who had worked in Tibet for 10 years and taken photographs because he was a photographer and a tour guide, basically. And so I had a mass of photographs, and we formed these into 100 of them into sets. And I was all ready to go. And after a first year where the Tibetans basically introduced me to their teachings and made sure I wasn't a complete ignoramus, then they let me go to a monastery in the south of India where a Rinpoche guided my work and helped me with the work, which also included me going to Ladakh because there was a Ladakhi monk at that monastery. who gave me introduction to Ladakh, which was both physically, emotionally, psychically, psychologically, spiritually, the highest point in my life. I mean, it was quite phenomenal, that work in Ladakh. And so the 3 years of work with the Tibetans actually confirmed and emphasized what I'd found with the yogis, that years of practice do enhance clarity of awareness at the psychic level. So you don't notice much for the first 10, 15 years. You're more or less along with normal people, where some people are open and aware and other people are closed. You've got that. But over the years, so the graphs showed quite clearly the increasing level of clarity of awareness.
So that's very interesting, because both the Indian and Tibetan traditions talk about, basically, as you meditate longer, the mind settles down to its resting state and sort of clarifies. It talks about the emergence of the siddhis, and that's in Patanjali's yoga writings, isn't it? But it's also in Tibetan ones as well, unless I'm very much mistaken. But you found basically that there was empirical support for those ideas.
Yes, absolutely. So initially, I gave a paper for the SBR, one of their conferences, on Tibetan psychic traditions. And that came from talking that my first year in Dharamsala, when I was being introduced to Tibetan teachings. And there was this most amazing Tibetan Rinpoche who was he was pure love. You were only allowed to spend 20 minutes in his presence, and I would come out like a hot air balloon. I'd be floating. He was just so incredible. And he essentially introduced me to all the different Tibetan teachings around psychic awareness. And that formed the body of that paper that I gave to the SBR and that got published in the journal. And I had come across the initial ideas from the Dalai Lama's book, Freedom in Exile. And he has a chapter called Magic and Mystery in Tibet. And that chapter title comes from one by a woman who back in the 20s, I think, had written a book of that title.
Yes, Alexander David Neal.
Alexander David Neal, talking about the Tibetan psychic traditions. And they definitely link it with meditation and increasing experience. And they take it far further than the yogis do, because they say that if you can become conscious at that level of consciousness, which is the psychic level, which is outside of time and space, the deep consciousness, almost deep, well, dream level is outside of time and space, but way into that, the depth of it, the dream yoga level, then when you die, you can die consciously, and you can go with that level of mind separate from the body to be reincarnated in a conscious way. And the people they call Rinpoches are people who have done this conscious rebirth and who have brought with them all the knowledge and ability and understanding and talents from their previous life. So some of the people I worked with in my research were these Rinpoches. 3 of them. I worked with 3 Rinpoches who had, according to the yogis, had this knowledge. And there was also one person, a monk, who in his previous life had been an abbot. So he'd been a very high monk, although he hadn't actually been a Rinpoche. And one of the things that came out from my research that was completely unexpected, but absolutely gobsmacked the Rinpoche I was working with, was that 3 of the people, that was one of this monk and 2 of the Rinpoches, had memories when they were children, not only memories but also behavior that came from their previous life in Tibet. And that had been when the Chinese had invaded, and they had suffered absolute horrors. They'd been starved to death. they had been tortured, and they'd come through with these memories. Now, what was amazing about them was that they were all, 3 of them, those who had these bad memories, were people who scored on the research at this significant negative level that I mentioned earlier. The people who always get it wrong, the people who always cut the falling paint pot. And talking with the Rinpoche, what we realized was that their memories were so horrific that at a psychic level, they had been so traumatized that they were blocking. They were supremely psychic. They were, scoring 20% instead of 80%, supremely psychic. But they were so traumatized at a psychic level that they were blocking their gifts, blocking their wisdom, blocking their knowledge, blocking their understanding. And he was so amazed by this that he asked, when I finished work with them, for a copy of the computer program that we were using that was enabling us to see this blocking effect, so that they could see which Rinpoches had, or monks, high monks, had been so traumatized by the Chinese experience with the invasion of Tibet, and that they could then help them work their way through and get through the blockages. So that, for me, apart from that we showed experimentally that years of meditation increased psychic awareness and clarity of awareness, it also meant on a very practical level to help the Tibetans overcome the psychic traumas from the Chinese invasion.
That's a whole other dimension, isn't it? The sort of brings in the issue of survival. I think this is the issue that I quite often face, that in our culture, it's difficult enough to convince people to take experimental parapsychology seriously, but when you begin bringing in evidence of survival, of possible survival of personality, that's another layer of difficulty. But what I find striking is, as we move through the conversation, is how persistent and consistent a lot of this material is. So you related psi functioning with subliminal perception, and you saying it functions similar. And Jim Carpenter's theory seems to back that up. And what that says to me is that psi isn't some special power that's an extra. It's an integral part of human functioning, sort of cognitive and perceptual functioning. And I think that's something that's quite important to emphasize. The other point I'd like to pick up is when you were talking about the pineal gland. So that would be, and I know that's been found to be associated with the melatonin, serotonin, sleep-wake cycle, hasn't it? And melatonin is associated with dreams. So it seems that this traditional knowledge was actually holding something that's directly comparable to current neuroscience.
Yeah. What do you want me to say? You just memorize what I've been talking about.
Okay. So, yes, but no, I think that's interesting. I mean, but what interests me about the traditions like Vedanta, the Hindu Vedanta tradition, is this idea that you have layers of reality. So you've got sort of the gross layer, which is like the physical layer, isn't it, that we can see. And then there's the subtle layer, that's associated with things like dreams, isn't there? And then there's a very subtle or causal layer underneath. For me, that makes sense of a lot of these different things, basically. It's a theory that can potentially bring some of these issues together. So that's really interesting. I mean, I remember, though, going to visit you at, there's a Tibetan Buddhist monastery outside Lockerbie called Sami Ling, and you did some experimental work up there as well, didn't you? And the results were different, weren't they?
Well, we were doing something slightly different there. This was another member of the SBR, Adrian, who was very interested in the effect of the Earth's magnetic field on our consciousness. Now, when I was doing my research into the pineal gland, one of the things that became very apparent is it's not just connected with sleep, but it's connected with the sleep-wake cycle. And it's part of the biological clock. It's part of the whole mechanism for the biological clock. And what they found in looking at biological clock is that there's what is called solilunar variation, that it's not just to do with the seasons and the change in amount of light from summer to winter, but also that the moon has an effect on our circadian rhythm. And this was then found to be because of the moon's effect on the Earth's magnetic field. And the research on the pineal gland had shown that it was exquisitely sensitive to changes in the Earth's magnetic field, and that people who were kept in a shielded room with no possibility of any geomagnetic radiation, no electromagnetic, no sun, no electromagnetic radiation, and they were kept without clocks and so on, that they would come onto a lunar cycle, that their sleep-waking cycle would become a lunar one. So he then took, quite a lot of research had shown geomagnetic effects. There's somebody called Persinger who had worked a lot with this, and its relationship to psychic awareness. Now, at Samye-Ling, it's only 1 mile away from a geological observatory, which is run by Edinburgh University and which measures changes in geomagnetic variation to the point that they use it for keeping the satellites in space, because the satellites are affected by solar plasma, which makes the northern lights. Yes, so you know, it's all interconnected. So he got permission that we could get their data, and their data would be absolutely specific for Samye-Ling, 1 mile away, because it was only a mile away. So what they were measuring would be absolutely accurate for what was happening with the geomagnetic variation at Samye-Ling. We worked with Samye-Ling because I had found that Tibetan Buddhist meditators who had got years of experience tended to be the ones who were most psychic, who were most open to clarity of consciousness, as I was calling it.
Mm.
So that's why we worked with them. We worked with them because they were going to be people who were most sensitive, who were most aware, most clear in their psychic level of being. Now, what we were aiming for was, when we started work, that the sun has an 11-year cycle, and it goes from peak sunstorm level, which we're at the moment, these amazing northern light displays that people are experiencing, down to the minimum when there's very little activity. And that is an 11-year where it's 5 years going up and 5.5 years coming down. So we were at the bottom point, and we were hoping that over the next 4 years that we had again a grant from BL, who had funded the work before, that over the next 4 years it would be going up towards its peak. Unfortunately, you can't put the sun in a laboratory, and the sun didn't play ball with us. And from going from its normal bottom level, it spent the next 2-3 years going down and down and down to a level below what it had ever gone before. And then it started to come up. So we didn't get the variation in the sun's effect on the Earth's magnetic field that we were hoping to get. So basically the experiment was null and void. However, with the sort of data that we did get, there was some change in magnetic field.
Okay.
A little bit. Not much, but there was some change. And what I found with this truncated experiment, it needs to be done again with the sun playing ball, going from bottom to top or going from top to bottom, whichever way you want to take it. But there was a little bit of variation. And what I found was that the people who are most sensitive to the changes in Earth's magnetic field were the people whose scoring on this free response program that we had, it correlated. So,
yes.
So we had a very strong correlation with those people who are most sensitive. So there's a measure, I can't remember the questionnaire. It was one that was devised by somebody called Vernon Knepp. No, the name of the questionnaire has gone from my mind at the moment. But anyway, there's a questionnaire that shows whether you are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field or not. And it's related to epilepsy because it's a temporal lobe. It's a temporal lobe questionnaire looking at the temporal lobe and the sorts of things that are connected with the temporal lobe. You need to go to my research papers to get the details because it's a long time ago now and I don't keep all the details in my mind anymore. But anyway, those people who are most sensitive to changes in the Earth's magnetic field, their psychic awareness related to those changes. That's what we found.
So what you're saying is that a lot of these abilities seem to vary with sort of factors like fluctuations in the Earth and the Moon and the Sun. So that speaks of some very deep, again, subliminal connections between human beings and the rest of the universe. And I understand this might not be a question you've directly researched, but do you think things like environmental awareness are linked to sensitivity to those cycles?
Absolutely. If you are somebody who is living out in nature without telephones, without clocks, without electricity, you're living what one might call a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. You are right out there. You become incredibly sensitive. But if you're living in a city surrounded by traffic, by electromagnetic radiation, by concrete, by all of these non-natural human creations that we have surrounded ourselves with, it all gets completely blocked out. It's incredibly difficult to be sensitive. So I know for me that I used to spend at least 6 weeks every summer living in a tent out in a field, and my level of sensitivity to everything around me would increase enormously. And so I live now with my back garden basically going into a field. So at least half of me is out there, even if the other half is within the modern human world that essentially cuts us off from our awareness. And if you think of the Tibetans, who were nomadic people up in the high Himalayas, one of the geshes I worked with in Ladakh, he said to me that, living in Leh, which was for us a small town, meant that he was not as aware as he would be if he was back in his remote Himalayan valley, where there was no electricity and cars and all the rest of it. And then he would be much more aware, much more sensitive. But living in a town with a television and radio and so on, this was blocking his awareness.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. It's something I've thought about quite a lot, because I think, looking at when environmental damage gets done just locally, one thing that has really struck me about our culture that's actually, I'm afraid, I think got worse in the last 20, 30 years is this isolation from the natural world. And I often think that one of the reasons why our culture causes so much damage is that we've managed to sort of cocoon ourselves against any of that sensitivity. And I often think about that when I see green campaigns about trying to get people to care about environmental issues. And I think if we're so thoroughly cut off, it's going to be very difficult to care, isn't it? Because it's not part of your world.
Yeah. How can you care about something that you know nothing about?
Yes.
It's as simple as that.
Yes. So, I mean, it's very important because we're in an era of sort of climate breakdown and polycrisis. And I remember one of our earlier conversations, you mentioned a book called Limits to Growth. So can you tell me how that particular book influenced your thinking in
more than
another big question?
It influenced my whole way of life. So I came across Limits to Growth back in 1973. I think it was published a year or two earlier, but anyway, it was the book that everybody, all the hippies, all of those who took acid and changed our consciousness and were waking up and reforming ourselves. It was the book that was doing the rounds. It was written by a group called the Club of Rome, and they had done these computer predictions looking at what was happening in human culture. And they were saying that we were on exponential growth for a large number of things, one of which included technology, interestingly enough. And that has come true, the exponential growth in technology. But one of the things they looked at was climate change and what was then called the greenhouse effect, which had been studied for many, many years, but before the 70s. If we think of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring back in the 50s, and for the Soil Association that started up in the 40s. So lots of work had already been going on, but they saw what was happening and they predicted this catastrophic effect on climate if we carried on pouring CO2 into the atmosphere. And that is exactly what is happening. So at that point, partly connected with the book, Limits to Growth, we had groups like Friends of the Earth forming, we had Greenpeace forming. All of this was forming in late 60s, early 70s. It was a big shift in consciousness that was happening amongst us young hippies, essentially, although not only, but mostly people who had taken acid and mescaline and opened their doors of perception and become very sensitive and awake and aware. And so we were changing our lifestyle. So that was the beginning of the whole food revolution. People eating brown rice and muesli as they were seen at that time, but which has gone on to the growth of organic farming and not eating processed foods. So, growing your own, making your own, cooking your own, natural food stuff. So live simply so others can simply live. This was one of the slogans that was out at the time, or treading lightly on the earth was another one. Self-sustainability movement, people moving to Wales to make their own little small holdings was happening. So a huge thing happening with regard to how one lived one's life to be sustainable. So, for instance, I have refused to own a car or drive a car ever because I saw that cars were part of it. I've always had an ethical bank because I saw that banking was fueling the destruction of nature. And at the same time, we had the humanistic psychology movement that was really developing, Gestalt psychology and all of that. All of the psychotherapies were becoming very strong, so that people could change within themselves, because that is really important. If you don't have the change within yourself, how can you change outside of yourself?
Yes.
So together with the Eastern stuff, the yoga, the meditation, the Buddhist meditation, and all of that, there was the psychological movements that were going on. I mean, masses of them. Mm. So it was a whole lifestyle change. And I now live in essentially a zero carbon house, because even though it's an ex-council house and I have had very little money, if I would make a resolution to change one thing every year, so that it would become embedded in my life. And bit by bit, by bit, by bit, by bit, I changed my lifestyle so that I am essentially carbon neutral in my lifestyle in every single way, in terms of the food I grow, the fuel I use, and so on. And that feels really important, because how can I help others? How can I help the planet if I haven't actually made the change within myself.
Yes, I think it's that sort of intersection between the transformation of consciousness or shift in consciousness and ecological awareness and action seems crucial to me. Last week, I went on the Restore Nature Now march in London, which was very empowering. But I noticed that an awful lot of it's focused on the stats, and a lot of which are very dire. And I've noticed that a lot with climate breakdown, but also news about extinctions. And a lot of it's presenting these facts and figures to people, which I think is very important. But there seems to be very little awareness of that inner dimension, which has always struck me as absolutely crucial. Just going into a woodland is a spiritual experience. It is. And you feel, or just going into the garden actually this time of year, we've got swallows nesting, and we've got beautiful flowers everywhere. And that sort of raw experience, it reminds you why you want to protect something and why it's so important. And for me, things like these altered states of consciousness, it's a heightened version of that basic experience, which is connection with a living planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, changing one's lifestyle, changing one's state of consciousness, and connecting with woodland, with wetland, with the oceans, is essential. And now that more than 50% of the human population are living in cities, I can only say that my experience is one of grief. So when I used to read New Scientist, and when in the 90s I saw that insurance companies were stopping insuring people because of increased flooding and hurricanes and so on, and when I saw that the Northern Pump, which controls the Gulf Stream, was slowing down, I knew we'd gone beyond the tipping point. So I'd gone beyond, at that point, I went beyond hope, and hope is linked with despair. So I went beyond hope and despair, and I'm in grief. So I know how few insects are. I've only seen swallows once this year. I've only seen swifts once this year, whereas the skies used to be covered in them. There's no butterflies around, hardly any, no dragonflies, no moths. The last time one drove a car and had to stop because the windscreen was covered in insects was probably 30 years ago. And people don't notice an absence. They don't notice an absence. They aren't aware of an absence. So they aren't noticing how depleted our environment has become.
What Lies Beyond with Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.